Hi there, I thought I'd do a quick video showing how I install Mylar hinges. Now Mylar hinges we can use for rudders, elevators, elevons, ailerons, all those kind of moving surfaces that we have on our model aeroplanes. So the next question is, what is Mylar? So we'll have a look at some Mylar hinges here. So essentially Mylar is a high strength plastic, and I just looked it up on Google, and it said it was an extruded polyester made from polyethylene. So there you go. And I mean, it comes in lots of different forms. Lots of different manufacturers do Mylar hinges in different sizes. I mean, this came as a sheet and you just cut it to size. I really like these ones that come from the World models because they've got like a textured surface which is really good when you glue them in. These are okay, but you have to roughen them up yourself. And when we glue them in, we generally, or I glue them in with a thin CA, and it just wicks right into the hinge, and I've never ever had one fail. I've always used thin CA. Now I only use Mylar hinges in specific places these days because essentially when you've got a hinge with a pin in it, you've got really free movement. With Mylar, you've got quite a lot of resistance there that the servo has to work hard to bend the control surface, particularly if you've got 3 of these or 4 of these in a line, then there's quite a lot of resistance. Now I'm going to put Mylar hinges on these elevons. Oops, let's just on these elevons here. We've got 2 elevons on the back of this flying wing, but the technique is exactly the same whether you've got a flying wing, a jet, a normal fixed wing aeroplane, whatever. It's still the same technique. And I'm going to be putting 3 hinges in this, spread out quite evenly. But because I don't like these big hinges, because they've got quite a lot of resistance, I'm just leaning over for some scissors, I'm going to cut them in half, and that will give me a much bendier hinge. There's less resistance there, and that will be a lot better. And these are still extremely strong, so I have no concerns about lack of strength by cutting these hinges down. I mean, these have a slot here which I think is designed to allow the glue to kind of wick down the hinge, but to be honest, thin CA is, you know, it travels really well when you put it on. Now the first thing we need to consider is what we're going to stick the hinges into. I mean, they're very thin, and so on the elevon, or the control surface should I say, we just need to cut a slot in the center of the control surface. And on the back of the wing we need to cut a slot as well. But something that we should be really mindful of is, on this flying wing for example, the trailing edge is made up of 2 sheets of 1/16 balsa that just come down to a point and join together. Now we can cut a little bit of a slot there and we can push these in, but there's very, very little for them to glue onto, very little purchase once they're being glued. Now this wing is built to the plans, and there is no provision where the hinges are to add some more strength, and that is very, very typical of lots of different plans I've worked from. They don't show anything for you to put your hinges in to get a little bit more strength, but I'm not really satisfied with that. So I've cut some triangular pieces of balsa, and I'm just going to draw on where I need my hinges, and then I'm just going to slot these into the back of that trailing edge. Hopefully that shows up, and then we'll cut our hinge at that location, and we'll have a nice piece of balsa for the hinge to go in and to be glued into. So it's going to be so much stronger. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to mark out, just prop this up so it doesn't move, we're going to mark out where the hinges need to go. on this back control surface. Now I've marked 3 locations on both the control surface and the trailing edge for where the hinges are going to go. One smack bang in the centre, another one close to the end, it's actually about 1 inch from that end, and this one is 1 inch from this end. When I chose the end locations, I was very mindful of where the servo is going to go, and hence the control horn on the control surface. And so we're going to have a control linkage coming down there, so I wanted to be sure that the the hinge was clear of that control horn, which it is, so that's a good location. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to CA in these triangular pieces of balsa into the trailing edge, and then we can look at how we're going to mark out and cut the slots. Right, I've now glued in those pieces of balsa, and hopefully they just show up glued in there. And I've got the marks translated from the top of this trailing edge, and I've put that on the surface that we need to cut to put the hinge in. And I've also lined that up with the control surface as well. So I don't know whether that shows, but you can see 2 lines on both the control surface and the trailing edge, just showing where the hinge slot needs to go. Now we need to think about cutting in the hinge slot, but before we do that we have to find the centre, and it's important that we get a nice central hinge, or we're not going to get a very smooth control surface. Now there are a couple of tools that I've got that you could use. You've got something like this which finds the centre, put it like that, and you can use a tool or you can use a pencil to mark a line. I generally don't use that. I'm not a great lover of that, particularly on thin surfaces like this. Another tool which has got a centre point, you can put on, just twist it and it just scores a line. I actually prefer this, and I don't know whether that shows up there, but there is a score line, and we can put a pencil line in that, and hopefully that shows up a lot better. So we could use this. I mean, I often do it by eye, and I find that quite successful. I think how you do it will just depend on not only the equipment you've got, but also just how you prefer to work. This is how I do it anyway. And so we've got the central line now for these 3 hinges that we need to cut. On the trailing edge we can do exactly the same, or with this we've got 2 sheets of 1/16 balsa coming together, and that where they come together is going to be the central line, because we've got 1/16 and 1/16, so it's a lot easier on the trailing edge. Now how we cut the slot again is down a lot to preference, how you prefer to work. You can get tools like this, which you also get with these centre finders, and you push in and wiggle it, and I do use that with some of the bigger hinges, but with Mylar I just prefer to use a scalpel and a nice sharp blade, so a brand new blade. And I'll just show you how I'm going to do that, and in fact I'll just zoom the camera a little bit on what I'm going to work on. Now I'll try not to get my fingers in the way as I'm filming this, but essentially just I get the scalpel and I find the centre line, and I just do a slot, and I just start very gently to start with. Don't want to cut too much. I mean, this control surface is I think it's 1/8 balsa, so it's quite thin, but I have done it on thinner balsa quite easily. And then you just work your way in, and once you've got a little bit of the way in, you can just push your blade in and then work it along the slot. I mean, it's obviously really important that we don't come out into the control surface. If we do, we can glue it and we can start again. It's easy enough. Now you can see that hasn't come out at all, it hasn't even bulged. And what we can do is we can take our Mylar hinge and we can just push that in there. And there we are, we've got a slot. Might need to be a little bit deeper. Let's just see how far that goes in. No, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. So I will do all 3 hinges now like that. Right, I've got all 6 slots cut now, the 3 in the control surface and the 3 in the trailing edge. So we should just be able to slide this on now and see how it looks. Now the last thing I want to do at this stage is start gluing the hinges. I'm not going to do anything now with these hinges until we've got this covered. So I'm going to take off the control surface, take the hinges out, and I'm going to get it covered. And then I will cut the slots in the film, put the hinges in and glue it. But it's good at this stage just to check that that is working nicely, which it is. And if we just move that around, you can see the end there. And that's, now we've trimmed those hinges down, that is moving. There's still resistance, but there's still it's still quite free moving, which is really good. Well, as I said, the last thing we want to do is start gluing the hinges in at this stage, because it'll just make the covering process a little bit trickier. So we'll take this out, content that we've got it done right, and when this is finished, we'll get that covered. Right, I've now got this wing covered, and I'm about to start covering the elevons. And I've got the left elevon here, and I know it's the left because I put a small L on the inside surface there where it wouldn't be seen through covering. Last thing you want to do is cover a model and find you've got a big L or something written on it. And I know we can rub it out, but sometimes it doesn't come out that easy. So what I'm going to do now, before I cover this, I'm going to make sure I know where the slots are in the wing. So I've got the hinges in the elevon. I'm going to hold it up against the wing, and I'm just going to use my scalpel, and there we go. And there we just now have found the slot for that hinge, because before that you couldn't see because of the covering. So I'm just going to go around and just make sure I know where all these slots are, and then I'm not kind of diving around in the dark trying to find a slot. There we go. So I will now get these elevons covered, and then we can get them glued in. And actually I should have said, once I've got the elevons covered, I can put the hinges in the slots I've just cut and line up the slots in the elevons. So anyway, I'll get on and do that. Right, well, I've now got the elevons covered, so let's get these hinges glued in and get the elevons glued into the wing. Okay, so once we've cut our slots, we can put our hinges into one of the surfaces, either the wing or the elevon. I've got them here in the wing, and we need to make sure that we don't push them in too far. So we can use one of the hinges from the other side, or we can measure just how far they've gone in. And it's important we don't put them in 50% of the distance, because we need to allow a little bit for the gap between the two surfaces, because we need to leave a little bit of a gap so that they actually work. We obviously don't want to push them right home. So once we've got that like that, make sure they're all nice and square, which they are, and all we're going to do now is get our thin CA, and we are just going to wick this in. And this thin CA is so thin it will just disappear down that small slot that we've cut in the film. We can remove a little bit of the film if we want. I used to just take a little bit out, but to be honest, I really don't think it's necessary because it's so thin. And as you can see, I'm doing both sides here. So just a little squirt of CA, and we'll just leave that now and just make sure that that has nicely dried, gone off, whatever. And then once we're sure it's done that, we're going to push that into the wing, and we're going to make sure we've got that distance just right. Right, now I just said we need to make sure that the CA has gone off on these hinges before we start to assemble it. And the reason being, if the CA is still a little bit wet because we put too much on, and it gets halfway in and decides to cure, then we're stuck with a a hinge halfway in, halfway out, which will just create real issues for us trying to separate it. So right, now there we go. Now that is looking about right. We don't want them too close because we need to make sure we've got room for movement, but we don't want them too far out either, and we've got to make sure that that there is a good distance so it's not catching on the end of the wingtip. I'm going to pull that a little bit that way. There we go. Right, now we've got that about right. I'm quite happy with that, and we've got plenty of movement there. I mean, on these flying wings we need very little movement, and all I'm going to do now is stand this up on its end. I'm going to get my thin CA and I'm just going to do exactly the same and wick this CA into the hinge, making very careful we don't get this rolling down the wing covering. And again, I will do both sides just as before. Right, I've now got that one glued, and I always find once I've glued them just to work them a little bit, just to I think sometimes the CA just crystallises on the hinge a little bit, and I find doing that just sort of softens it up a little bit and makes them a little bit more easier to move. Now that is a really nice hinge. We haven't got a great gap there, but we've got enough clearance for the hinge to work properly. As I said before, when you're using Mylar hinges, you do have a little bit of natural resistance there, but that is very small really, and the servos, these mini servos I'm going to put in, are going to be more than strong enough to cope with that. And on these wings they have very little movement anyway. So I'm going to get the other hinged elevon done now, and then we'll be done. Well, I've now got the elevons all glued in with those Mylar hinges, and to be honest, it couldn't be simpler gluing them in. There's no hinges to accidentally freeze up like you have with pin hinges. You just wick the CA into the slot you've cut and it's done. It really couldn't be easier. I guess the hardest thing with this kind of technique, if you've got thin control surfaces like these, is getting the slots in. But a lot of the time, thicker control surfaces, you know, you can get them in really easy. There is that natural resistance which I've talked about, which is one of the reasons I've stopped using Mylar hinges on some of my vintage models where I want the control surfaces really free. But on something like this, we've got very little movement needed anyway, and we've thinned down the hinges. It's a perfect solution to my mind. So anyway, I hope you found this useful and interesting, and thanks very much for watching.